A reading from the book of Exodus. In today's scripture lesson, Moses is encountered by the Lord in the burning bush. He is called to his mission to lead his people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinfolk. He looked this way and he looked that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you the ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so early today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with them, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom. For he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them." Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw this, he turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," he said. "Here I am." And then he said, "Come no closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of the people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land that was good, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites." Lots of sites. "The cry of the Israelites now came to me, and I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh and bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." The word of the Lord.
At this time, we're going to go and see the places where this story happens. So if we can have the video now, please.
In our first session, we left Moses in Thebes, and it was there that he grew up to the age of 40. And Acts 7:22 says, "Moses learned everything Egyptian wisdom had to offer, and he was a man of powerful words and deeds." So we've come to the land of Goshen, the breadbasket of Egypt. And we've come here because Moses came here at the age of 40, grown up in the lap of luxury, educated by the finest teachers, grown up in Pharaoh's own house in the midst of wealth and power, and yet he'd always known that he was an Israelite who was adopted into Pharaoh's household. And I think at the age of 40, he was having an existential crisis, if you will. He was trying to figure out, who am I really? And so he came to the land of Goshen because this is where the Israelites had settled under Joseph. But more than that, it's where the Israelites were in bondage, where they were forced into the building of projects for the pharaohs. And when he arrived here in the land of Goshen, he immediately encountered an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite slave. And so what he did, the feelings of justice began to permeate, that began to well up within his heart, and he decides that he has to do something. One day, after Moses had become an adult, he went out among his people, and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked around to make sure no one else was there. Then he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Someone saw Moses kill the man and reported it to Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh heard, Moses was considered to be a great threat. A great threat because he was born among the Hebrews, raised in Pharaoh's household, and now, having seen the Israelites suffering, he actually killed an Egyptian to protect them. And so a death sentence was issued for Moses. And Moses flees, and he travels across the Sinai Peninsula to the land of Midian. Now, Midian, as you can see in the map, was at this time primarily in western Saudi Arabia and the regions around it, but likely also included parts of the Sinai Peninsula. And tradition has it that Moses actually travels down to the southern Sinai. It's there that Moses meets Zipporah and ultimately marries her and becomes a sheep herder for his father-in-law. And he'll spend the next 40 years in this land. I'd like to take you there so that you can see this place where Moses will spend 40 years tending his father-in-law's sheep. So what you see in the distance then is both the place where Moses would have tended his father-in-law's flocks. This again is the land of Midian, and he would have tended his flocks in that valley. And then in a subsequent episode, I'm going to take you there, and we'll remember the fact that this is where the Israelites, after they were set free from slavery in Egypt, came and encamped at the base of Mount Sinai. This is the land of the Sinai, a barren land. It's a very difficult and harsh land. Desert-like, there are wells and oases in various places. And to this day, you continue to see sheep herders tending their sheep in this area. I want you to imagine the man who'd grown up, a prince in Egypt, living in the beautiful city of Thebes along the banks of the Nile River, now spending the next 40 years of his life living here in this barren wasteland. One day, at the age of 80, Moses is tending his father-in-law's flocks in the wilderness around Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. And as he's tending them, he notices that there's a bush that's set aflame. And he goes to see what's going on. And the bush is not consumed by the fire. He hears a voice coming out from the bush saying, "Moses, Moses." And he's terrified. "Here am I," he says. And then he hears these words, "Moses, take off your shoes, for you're standing on holy ground." And so Moses removes his shoes, his sandals. And then he says, "Who are you?" And the voice from the bush says, "I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've heard the cries of my people, Israel, suffering in bondage in Egypt. And Moses, I've chosen you. I've chosen you to set them free." In our own lives, we're meant to, when we look at the Moses story, part of what we're meant to ask is, where is God calling us? Are we paying attention to the places where God is inviting us, beckoning us, calling us to be a part of His work and His purposes? And we're meant to remember that Moses, though he argued with God in the end, finally said, "Okay, I'll go. Here am I. Send me." In the 300s, a monastery was built at this location that marks the place of the burning bush and where Moses experiences his call. We're at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai. It was built in the 4th century. St. Helen, the mother of Constantine, was actually the person to build the first church here, recognizing the importance of this place as the location where Moses first met God. So we're going to go inside and tour the monastery. Let's take a look. So of course the doorways are designed to require you to bow as you enter, as a way of expressing adoration, worship, humility as you come into this place. There we go. An active monastic community that lives here, and of course a large number of people who come as pilgrims visiting this place. Christians largely, but of course there are many others who come too. Jews and Muslims who also come to revere, and of course for Muslims, Moses is a great prophet. For the Jewish people, he is their founding lawgiver, prophet, lawgiver, and this place represents Judaism's defining story. The monastery is surrounded by beautiful mountains, including the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, and you can understand why for 1,700 years Christian monks, monastics have come to this place to meet God and to listen for God's call on their own lives, something that we still seek to know and do to this day. Here we find the 4th century church that St. Helen built in honor of Moses and his encounter with God in the burning bush in this place. And though we can't go inside, it's forbidden to take cameras inside. I've been inside, it's beautiful. But this is where people, well, from the time of Moses, so for 3,200 years have encountered God in this place, in this valley, surrounded by the mountains, with Mount Sinai behind us here. And today, pilgrims still come here to meet God. So as you come through the monastery, on the back side of the chapel, you find this bush. They call this the burning bush. It's unique. It continues to grow and grow, but has never been watered by the monks. And they claim that sometimes at night they'll see lights flickering inside of it. Exodus chapter 2, verse 16 says this, "Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill it from a well. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up, came to their rescue, and watered their flock." And of course, one of those young women was a woman named Zipporah, who would become Moses' wife. And this well, located within the confines of the St. Catherine Monastery, is said to be the well, Moses' well, where he drew the water and provided it for Zipporah, his wife, or his future wife. It was here in the wilderness, in front of that burning bush, that God spoke and revealed himself to Moses. And he said these words, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." I love this text because it tells us that God sees our suffering. He hears our cries. And he knows our pain, and he longs to do something about it. But I want you to notice what it says. God doesn't send angels to go deliver the Israelite slaves. He sends an 80-year-old stuttering sheep herder who's a fugitive from the law. He says, "Now you get going. I'm sending you." God still works in this way today. God sees and hears and knows the pain of other people, and then he longs to place that on our hearts. He longs to speak to us. And the burning bushes today may be a news story we see on television and we feel a nudge. It may be seeing somebody in God's Spirit touching us and saying, "I need you to do something about this." It's looking around the world to see where is the world not yet like God wants it to be, and what does God want to do through us to make a difference. And my hope and prayer is that though we all have 1,000 excellent excuses as to why God should use someone else, we might, like Moses in the end, say to God, "Here I am. Send me."
Well, that's quite a story, isn't it? This is the big story, as he said, for the Jewish people. The Muslim people see Moses as a great prophet. It's the big story for Christians in the Old Testament. There are many parallels to the Jesus story that we hear in the New Testament. Moses, in a couple of weeks, we'll hear him bring the law. You know, God gives Moses the law. Jesus gives kind of a new law on another mountain. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. So we'll get into that in a couple of weeks. But you know, it really depends where you're at in life, what you do with this story. And for African Americans, particularly those who were slaves for so long in this country, this story was a crucial story. And they sang Negro spirituals, we call them, like "Go Down Moses," as they pick cotton in the South. And that word that you heard at the end of that little video about God saying, "I've seen the misery, I've heard the cry, I know their sufferings, I'm going to deliver them." This idea was really captured by many people in our own lifetime, as some are pictured on the screen there. In the upper left, there was a man named James Cone who in 1970 wrote a book called Black Theology, and the core of that book was this story. And only the African Americans were the Israelites in slavery, particularly in the South of this country. Another author thought about Central America and Latin America, and he wrote the book on the right called A Theology of Liberation. And that this story is the core of that movement that was seen in El Salvador. In the lower right, you have a picture of Oscar Romero, who was the famous archbishop in El Salvador, and he was a leading spokesman of that group. Moving across to the left, of course, we think of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, who were kind of Moses figures in South Africa, and then Martin King, of course, Martin Luther King on the left. So we're going to take a quick look at this story from 4 different questions I want to have you ponder this morning. They're listed there on the left. And we're going to start with the first one about injustice and what we do with that. You've heard in a couple of ways this morning, actually 3, through the children's message, the reading, and Adam, the story of this confrontation but with the Hebrew slave and the Egyptian that's beating him, and then the women at the well. And what these things are is kind of 2 early defining moments for Moses, where he gets his start dealing with injustice. And all of us have that experience, not the exact same thing, but as we get older, we notice things. Maybe when we're just a child. I've talked to some people here that grew up in the South, and they tell me about 50 or more years ago, seeing these curious water fountains that said colored above them, and then that one to the right said white. And as children, they asked their mom and dad, "What's that about?" We have this experience in life where we get injustice kind of thrown in our face, and we have to learn to deal with it. John Lewis, pictured there on the top of the screen, is an amazing, courageous man that was a freedom writer in the early 60s and then worked with Dr. King to bring justice to people, particularly in the South. Now he's a congressman in Washington, D.C. Encourage you to learn more about him. A courageous man. But in the lower left or lower right there's some practical ways that I know a lot of you fight injustice in this world. And we give you thanks for doing that and encourage you to keep finding ways. As Adam said, find something that speaks to your need and your heart, and then use your time and your talent and maybe your treasure to make a difference in that area of injustice. I want to move on to the next thought, which is what happened to Moses, in a sense, happens to us when the bottom falls out and we end up in a wilderness. Again, you've heard the story. I don't need to repeat it, but he had everything, and then suddenly he had nothing. He went from riches to rags. And suddenly he's out there in a very strange place, learning a new profession, being a lowly shepherd, and is stuck out there for 40 years. Wildernesses come upon us at different times. Remember the fall of 2008? Remember what happened to your savings or your retirement fund, those of you that are a little older, when the Great Recession hit? And people all of a sudden were out of work, or banks were failing. And some of you that are older grew up in the Great Depression. And you remember your father perhaps being out of work, or maybe if you were on a farm, you lost the farm. And your mother taught you important lessons like save every nickel, make do with what you've got, sacrifice for the sake of your children and maybe your grandchildren. And that long wilderness lasted for a whole decade. But there are other kinds of wilderness times too that many of you have gone through, I know, where you lose what feels like everything. When you lose a spouse or a parent or a child. and it feels like your life as you knew it will be no more. Or when you go through an illness and you lose your health, an illness like cancer or Alzheimer's. Or when you struggle with depression or loneliness or addiction, that can feel like a wilderness. Or we think about all of these young adults going off to college now that have just graduated from high school, and you know that first fall when they're at a different place away from home can feel very strange, like a sort of wilderness. Or when they graduate from college and they maybe have to move far away from home to find a job, and they're in a major city with hundreds of thousands of young adults, but yet they can't get to know one. It can be a very lonely wilderness for young adults too. Thirdly, let's go back to the holy ground idea. This place was holy ground for Moses. If you're a Green Bay Packer fan, you know where holy ground is. Lambeau Field. We had our own Moses in the 1950s and 60s. His name was Vince Lombardi. But I want to not focus on that so much, but to say, you know, is there a holy ground for you in your life? Look at some of the possibilities on the screen. Is there maybe a church where you, as a child, grew up and worshiped? Maybe you were married in that church, and when you go back to it, does it feel like a special holy ground? Maybe outside the church, in the cemetery, your parents or your grandparents are buried there. Perhaps a Bible camp. We have kids going to camp today and most weeks of the summer. And for them, when they're sitting around the campfire, as was kind of illustrated in the children's message, and it's quiet, there are no cell phones, there's no electronic distraction, kids and young adult counselors can really feel God speak to them. Maybe it was a conference or convention you went to as a young adult. Maybe we used to call them Luther League conventions, and then later gatherings. Perhaps a mission trip. Some of you that are a little younger might have gone on. Maybe it's this very room. Maybe this is your holy ground, where you come and have a different time and hour from any other hour of the week. Or maybe it's a place out in nature, a cabin on a lake, a retreat place in the mountains, a condo on the ocean or the beach. Talk a little bit, would you, right now with somebody next to you, where is your holy ground? Or maybe there's a fifth option that I can't think of. Talk about that a little bit. Where's holy ground for you? Turn around if you need to talk to somebody. Well, I hope you have such a place. We need these places. We need these quiet places where we can get away and hear God speak to us, maybe through His Word, We sang a song a little while ago, Word of God Speak, right? And that's how this works, whether it's reading your Bible, coming here, singing the songs, maybe being in a quiet place in nature where you can really listen for that voice of God speak to you. The last thing I want to touch on is a piece that isn't brought up. We had to cut that reading off at some point for Randy's sake, you know. He did a great job with all those sites. Let's hear it for Randy, with that. But there was a piece I left off at the end, which is, what does Moses say when God is done calling him to do this? You ever said, yeah, but, either with your lips or maybe in your head? Somebody asks you to do something, you say, yeah, but. I'm too busy, basically, is what it always boils down to. Moses had a lot of yeah, buts. He had 5 of them. They're listed coming up on the screen. And the interesting thing is, with each one of them, there was a rebuttal to the yeah, but, as God reminded him of something or said, well, I'll take care of that. I'll provide for that lack that you're pointing out. And here they are. The first one, he says, who am I that I should go do this big job? You ever said that? When you get a call from the church, maybe a letter saying, we'd like you to do this big job, maybe serve on the council or be on a call committee or be on a building committee to build something like this, it's easy to say, who am I to do such a thing? And look what the answer is from God when he says, who am I? I will be with you. That's a timeless word for every one of you. When you get a phone call or a letter or an email that seems like it's way over your head, remember, he is with you as you seek to do that big task. And then secondly, Moses says, well, what do I say if they ask me what your name is? And you have the phrase, he says, my name is I am who I am, which became Yahweh, which became Jehovah. That's how that often appears in the Bible, or Lord capitalized, L-O-R-D. But then he links it to their story and says, I'm the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm not a new God, I'm an old God. Then we kind of dig a little deeper. This kind of begins to get a little more familiar territory for us. What if they don't believe me or listen to me and say the Lord did not appear to you? And look at the response there. This is a kind of an object lesson time. God says, okay, what's that thing in your hand, shepherd? And he says, well, it's a staff, of course. He says, throw it down on the ground. And you know what happened to that staff? What did it turn into? A snake. There you go. And then God said, okay, now pick up that snake by the tail. And as he does, what happens to the snake? It becomes a staff again. Yeah. And then he says, well, try this trick with those people. Put your hand inside your robe, and as Moses does, it becomes covered with leprosy when he pulls it out and looks at it. And then he says, put it back in there and pull it out, and it's back to normal. Little object lessons, little proofs, you might, not little, but miraculous things to help them along. Fourth, you ever said this? Well, I'm not a public speaker. I'm not eloquent. Moses was one of the early ones to say that. God says, I'll be your mouth. I'll be your mouth. I'll put the words in your mouth. And then finally, we hear that word. Haven't we all said this at one time or another? Please send somebody else. Please ask somebody else to do this job. And God at this point gets a little angry. We read in the story, and says, well, okay, you've got a brother named Aaron, and between the two of you, you'll get the job done. Aaron's a pretty good speaker, and he'll say the words for you. I'll pass them to you, you pass them to him, and between the two of you, you'll get it done. One last thing about the yeah buts. Years ago, we had a young adult here named Joy Waftel, who, after graduating from college, decided to spend a year in South Africa as a missionary. And she went there and came back and talked to us one summer, I believe it was, about her experience. We can go to the last slide. Back in 1999, that program started called Young Adults in Global Mission, or YAGM was the acronym. 8 people signed up the first year. This year, look at that, 96 are going to go starting in August for their year. And I don't know if you can make out the countries where you're sitting, but all of those little circles are countries. And this is not going to be a nice vacation to the Caribbean for the year. They're going to tough places like Rwanda, Serbia, Cambodia, South Africa to serve for that year. And we keep them in our thoughts and prayers. There's an example. Maybe some of these people had a burning bush kind of experience where God spoke to them and said, go to those places of injustice and make a difference. And that's our call too. As you head out today back into your daily life, look for a place of injustice and make a difference. Amen. Would you please stand for the Apostles' Creed?